potentially rainy Wednesday, although the storms ended just in time for our event to start. Our panel today is called Singapura Before Raffles, Early Modern Asia in the Global Renaissance. This afternoon's event is part of our 5-week-long Festival of Ideas in the Humanities and Social Sciences. And this is a celebration of the important research that's being done in the humanities and social sciences here at the autonomous universities in Singapore. My name is Reima Hokama, and I'm an assistant professor of English literature in the Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences Department, what we call FASS, at Singapore University of Technology and Design. And today I am incredibly excited and honored to be moderating a roundtable featuring my wonderful and dear colleagues working in history, literature, theater studies, political thought, and Asian studies from SUTD, NUS, NUS College, Yale NUS, SMU, and the University of Macau. We'll have a chance to explore important stories about Singapore and Asia's vibrant and global past in the early modern world. And in just a little bit, I'll introduce all of our speakers to you. But first, many thanks are in order. This event wouldn't have come into fruition without the wonderful work of our colleagues at the Ministry of Education, many of whom are here with us today. And so I thank them for this opportunity to convene this roundtable and also for the ongoing support for the research in the humanities and social sciences that we do here across all of Singapore's universities. And also, I hope you guys stick around at the end because we have wonderful treats and tea and coffee. It's never too late for caffeine in a week 13 at NUS and SUTD. And all of that is compliments of the MOE as well. And also, of course, on a bigger scale, much of the research that my colleagues are working on has been and has continued to be generously supported by the MOE's research initiatives. And the work that we're presenting to you today would not have come to fruition at all without the MOE's commitment to funding world-class humanities research here in Singapore. This afternoon's roundtable is partially being sponsored by a Tier 1 grant at SUTD on the Global Renaissance. And the aim of this project is to uncover some of the untold stories about Asia's dynamic past in the early modern world. So to our MOE colleagues who are here today, and especially to Mr. Peter Ho, who is chairman of the Social Science Research Council, Mr. Godwin Tang, who is director of academic research at the MOE, and also to Mr. Weijie Ng, Ms. Charlene Teo, Mr. Alex Sung, and Ms. Shirley Ong. Thank you very much on behalf of NUS and SUTD for your continued support for the work that we do. I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Asia Research Institute here at NUS, and also to Professor Elaine Ho. Elaine couldn't be here because she's actually in my home state of Hawaii for a conference right now. Elaine is a senior research fellow here at ARI, and Elaine really had the vision to suggest a co-sponsored event. And Professor Nala Lee and Ms. Rachel Amsis, as well as Mr. Yap Chuan Yo and Ms. Cheryl Chung, have been absolutely unflagging in their administrative support in the months leading up to this event. So thank you very much, Rachel and Cheryl and Yap Chuan as well, and they are the ones who are manning the Zoom chat. So the reason we're here today is to think about Singapore's role in our global world. Today, we're thinking about Singapore's role in our global past. And tomorrow at SUTD, we'll have a part 2 of this event where my colleagues in SUTD's Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities will tell us more about how their research is helping to imagine Singapore's role in the world now and also in the future. So I'm not Singaporean, and I'm very conscious of that as I'm moderating this event. You guys are conscious of that. As soon as I open my mouth, you know I'm not Singaporean. But some of our speakers today are Singaporean, and more importantly, I think most of you here in the audience today are Singaporean as well. And also, I was so delighted to look over the registration list very briefly last night. We have experts here in our audience, including Professor Peter Forsberg, who is an internationally renowned leading expert on early modern maritime law. We also have Yi Sheng, who is the author of a wonderful collection of short stories called The Lion City. Yi Sheng has thought deeply about the Malay annals in one of these stories in this collection, which we've taught at SUTD in the past. And I know that our students have been incredibly moved to see aspects of their early modern past reflected in this story. So we'll have a totally rich conversation with all of you guys at the end. I've been fortunate to call Singapore home for the past 7 years. And I think my own journey to Singapore from one small multicultural island, I'm from Hawaii, to a much bigger multicultural island is testament to Singapore's place in our global world. Singapore is a nation of immigrants and of travelers and visionaries, and a nation that is and has been for well over 500 years, a place that's open to the world and to global ideas. But more importantly, what today's speakers will show us is that Singapore and Singapura, or Temasek as this place was called in early modernity, also played an outsized role in shaping global ideas about political governance, freedom of the seas, international business, multiculturalism, and toleration. I'll give you 2 brief case studies, 2 minutes long, before introducing all of our speakers. And some of you are actually experts on this event. In 1603, an important maritime event happened here in the seas off Changi, actually not that far from where SUTD is today. A Dutch vessel launched a surprise attack on a Portuguese trading ship in the Singapore Straits, taking porcelain and silks and spices and all kinds of precious Asian commodities, totaling something like 200 million Singapore dollars today, so not a small sum. And of course, the Dutch East India Company, which profited from this surprise attack, hired a brilliant young lawyer named Hugo Grotius to defend the seizure of the Portuguese vessel's goods. And Grotius argued that the Portuguese efforts to limit free trade and international exchange in Asia was wrong for a number of reasons, not least of all because it denied Asian nation states the right to act as sovereign powers by picking who they wanted to do business with. And in Mare Liberum, which is Latin for the free sea, Grotius observed that Asian sovereign states had just as much right to political autonomy as their European counterparts. Grotius, of course, he never stepped foot in Asia, but he was deeply influenced by the many firsthand travel accounts of maritime journeys to Asia, brought back by merchants and sailors who wrote about their journeys to what is now Singapore and Malacca, Java, Borneo, Sumatra, the Siam Kingdom in Thailand, China, Sri Lanka, and India. And many of these travelers, like the Portuguese merchant Galeotto Pereira, who spent several years as a captive in Fujian, China, argued that his fellow Europeans could learn a lot about proper governance and even moral and civic virtue from Asia, where he observed many new forms of judicial codes and legal proceedings that he believed could help make Europe a more just and equitable society, if only those back home in Europe might be open to adopting some of these ideas. So the question is, how did it come to be that by 1819, when Sir Stamford Raffles landed in Singapore, and what is now Boat Quay, Europe's major powers seem to have forgotten Grotius's earlier arguments for political and cultural autonomy of Asian sovereign states? And is there more to be said about how early modern Asian innovations in civic government and jurisprudence helped to shape global debates about international law, sovereign power, and legal rights in the early modern world, as Pereira believed that they could? Today, our speakers will attempt to recover some of these untold stories about Singapore and Asia's powerful geopolitical and cultural role in the making of early modernity and the circulation of global ideas. Our speakers will answer some of these questions, but they're also going to raise many, many, many more questions in today's roundtable. And because Singapore was then and now always a place that had transcended borders and boundaries, some of our speakers will start off our event talking about Singapore specifically. And then in the second half, we'll have speakers talking about the Asian context in early modernity more broadly to help us situate Singapore's historical story in the wider Asia Pacific region. And we'll have speakers look specifically to China and India in today's event. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful speakers to you. And I'm going to introduce everyone all at once so that I won't have to keep interrupting as we go. All right. So our first speaker will be Emily Soon, and she is a lecturer of English literature at SMU. She received her PhD at King's College London, and her research focuses on cross-cultural literary exchange between Asia and Europe in the pre-modern and modern eras, with a particular emphasis on Southeast Asia. Her current book project explores how South and Southeast Asia inspired early modern English writers and shaped early modern religious exchange. Prior to joining SMU, she served as a research fellow at the National Museum of Singapore, where she studied Shakespeare's role in colonial Singapore. And today, Emily will be giving a talk entitled Imagining Southeast Asia and Maritime Trade in Early Modern Literature. So fascinating. Our next speaker will be Rowena Yip, who is lecturer in the humanities at NUS College. She received her PhD in theater studies from NUS, and her research focuses on the intersections between gender and theater, particularly in dramatic adaptations of Shakespeare in Asia. Her forthcoming book is entitled Gender in Asian Shakespeare Towards Intercultural Feminism. She is also assistant director at the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, a multilingual digital repository of performances of Shakespeare in East and Southeast Asia. And if you haven't looked at the website, I'd highly recommend it. It's so fascinating and great resource. Today, Rowena will be giving a talk entitled Identity Formation and Colonial Encounters in the Malay Annals. Our next speaker will be joining us from Zoom. Hannah Smith-Drelick is a lecturer in humanities at NUS College, and she holds a PhD in English literature from Stanford. Her research explores the intersection of food and literature in early modern England. And before completing her PhD, she received her BA from Williams College and an MA in food studies from NYU, as well as another MA in English from McGill. Her current project is called Altered Appetites, Food and Metaphor in Early Modern England. And this book situates appetite as a metaphoric nexus of early modern experience, drawing from fields that include the history of science and medicine, food history, manuscript and early print recipe traditions, and records of trade, agriculture, and food production. And Hannah's talk today is entitled Pepper, Nutmeg, and Flying Fish, the Foods That Fueled Southeast Asia's Trade with the World. Our next speaker will also be joining us on Zoom. Joshua Ehrlich is zooming in to us today from Macau, where he is assistant professor of history at the University of Macau. And Joshua is an award-winning historian of knowledge and political thought with a focus on the East India Company and the British Empire in South and Southeast Asia. He received his PhD and MA from Harvard and his BA from the University of Chicago. Joshua's first book, The East India Company and the Politics of Knowledge, came out last year from Cambridge University Press. And this book reveals how the company used its commitment to knowledge to justify its commercial and political power. It advances a new approach, the history of ideas of knowledge, to recover a world of debate among Indian and European thinkers on the political uses of knowledge. Ehrlich's many research interests include the boundaries and boundedness of port cities, the making and unmaking of libraries through plunder, the crisis of liberal reform in India, and the origins of Indian print culture. Today, Joshua will be telling us about parts of his book that focus on Singapore's role in the East India Company's ventures in Asia. His talk is entitled The East India Company and the Politics of Knowledge. Our third and final Zoom speaker will be Andrew Hui, who is joining us from Berlin, where he is currently a fellow at the Wissenschaft College zu Berlin. Andrew, when he's not traveling the globe, is associate professor of comparative literature at Yale NUS College, and he holds a joint appointment in the NUS English department as well. He is author of 3 books, The Poetics of Ruins in Renaissance Literature, A Theory of the Aphorism from Confucius to Twitter, which has been translated into 5 languages and counting. I'm sure there'll be many more. And he is also the author of the forthcoming book called The Study, The Inner Life of Libraries, which will be out from Princeton University Press later this year. It's very, very exciting. Today, Andrew will give a talk entitled Confucius the Stoic, the encounter between Western and Chinese philosophy in the global Renaissance. Our next speaker will be an in-person speaker. Melissa Tu is a lecturer of English literature at SUTD. She holds a PhD in English from Yale and an MPhil in medieval and Renaissance literature from Cambridge and a BA in comparative literature from Princeton. At Yale, Melissa worked as a digital humanities consultant at the Yale DH Lab. Her research and teaching interests include medieval English literature, media theory, lyric studies, manuscript studies, sound and voice studies, and music and musical performance. And she also plays the piano and the violin. Melissa will tell us about comparative poetry in a talk entitled The Lyric as Medium, Women's Voices in Classical Chinese and Middle English Lyric. And last but not least, our final speaker is a powerhouse. Walter Lim is Associate Professor of English Literature in the Department of English, Linguistics, and Theater Studies here at NUS. He teaches classes on the English Renaissance, William Shakespeare, and the relationship between religion and politics in Elizabethan, Stuart, and Revolutionary England. And he is the author or editor of 5 books, of which his most recent book is Shakespeare and the Theater of Religious Conviction in Early Modern England, which just came out a couple months ago. And he is currently, you can't not stop Walter from writing books. So Walter is working on 2 more books, one on the Anglophone Chinese diaspora and another on John Milton and the English Reformation. And today's Walter's talk will come from his most recent book, I believe, and it's entitled India and Global Commercialism in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. Let's give all of our speakers a round of applause. All right, so first we have Emily.
Hey, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so thank you for coming and thank you very much, Rima, for all this. I'm very much looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts. So the question I'll be speaking on today is, where is Singapore and Southeast Asia in the Renaissance literature of the 16th and 17th century? So in recent years, there's been a growing amount of historical interest in Singapore's long past. Historians have even shown us that by the 16th century, there was a Shabandiria or harbour master's compound on this island. So this shows that Singapore was already a thriving port city long before that arrived. So in the next few minutes, I will introduce some ways that port cities of Southeast Asia. I will introduce some ways the port cities of Southeast Asia have also had a presence in European Renaissance literature. So let's start with Singapore's presence in the Lusiad or Lusiads, an epic that is regarded as the national poem of Portugal. So this was first published in 1572 and then translated into English by Richard Fanshawe in 1655. So this traces Vasco da Gama's voyage from Lisbon to India in the late 15th century, a voyage that is credited with opening the sea route between Europe and Asia. Now, towards the end of this epic, a mythical goddess shows Vasco da Gama a globe. She reveals to him parts of the world that the Portuguese would come to know as they build their empire in Asia. And after describing South Asia, she points out the port of Malacca. She then turns to the tip of the Malay Peninsula. And at that point, the narrator declares that at that point, the Singapucks appear where the pinch strait leaves ships no room to play. And by Singapuck, she means Singapore. In the Portuguese version, it's spelled Singapura. Now, it's not quite clear why Fanshawe gave the name as Singapucks, but the key point, though, is that the text is highlighting that by the Renaissance, this island was already known as a location along the sea route connecting the Indian Ocean with territories further to the east. And Fanshawe's translation of these lines and the presentation of Singapucks or Singapura as a place where the ships had, quote, no room to play, further suggests that maritime trade here was, as you can see, a serious business, with sailors having to concentrate quite hard to sail through these waters. Now, while Fanshawe's translation of the Lusiad asserts that the ships had, quote, no room to play within the straits, English writers certainly found room to play with the idea of Southeast Asia or the East Indies in their literary creations. So I'll just introduce 3 of these.
So the English East India Company, or EIC, was founded in 1600. 13 years later, quite an intriguing spectacle appeared in London. And this occurred during the Lord Mayor Show, which is an annual pageant held to commemorate the swearing in of the city's new Lord Mayor. So Singapore equivalent would sort of be the Chingay Parade, where you've got elaborate pageant floats going through the streets. So in 1613, the pageant was commissioned by the Grocers Company, who distributed the spices that the East India Company imported. And so here you've got the company arms. So the black things are actually cloves, which are meant to emphasize the importance of spice to their business. So their pageant was titled The Triumphs of Truth, and it was written by the dramatist Thomas Middleton. So as part of this pageant, they created a display of 5 artificial islands. These were said, as you can see here, to be artfully garnished with all manner of Indian fruit trees, drugs, spiceries, and the like. So each was large enough for a human performer to stand on it. One even had a castle on it with another performer. And initially, these islands were floating on the River Thames. Later, they were moved on shore, where they were accompanied by a pageant ship with yet more performers. So the fact that these islands were said to contain Indian fruit trees and spiceries indicates that they were meant to represent islands somewhere in the East Indies, where the bulk of the word spices come from. So I'll spare you the geographical detail, but essentially what this pageant shows us, therefore, is that with the pageant ship and these islands, the pageant is trying very hard to bring the maritime trading world of Southeast Asia into the heart of London. As time went by, other writers would also feature Southeast Asia in their writing. So several years later, Shakespeare's collaborator and successor at the Globe Theatre, John Fletcher, wrote a play called The Island Princess, which is set in Maluku, in the Moluccan Islands in present-day Indonesia. Some decades later, the poet John Milton would likewise incorporate references to the spice trade in his epic poem, The Paradise Lost, and I believe Walter has also written about this in his work. Interestingly, it's thought that Milton may well have been engaging with Fanshaw's Luciad as he wrote epic. So in conclusion, while Southeast Asia may not have dominated Renaissance literature, the people and places of the East Indies certainly gave English writers ample room to play with in their literary work. Therefore, where literature is concerned, the European Renaissance really should be reconceptualized as the global Renaissance, as this entire roundtable seeks to illustrate. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. All right, our next speaker will be Rowena.
Hey, thank you very much, Rima, for organizing, getting us together. It's a privilege and delight for me to be part of this event. However, I must confess that when Rima first invited me, I felt very much an interloper. And so I want to reflect on my points of entry to the theme of this event, which is the global Renaissance. Now, while I did my master's, my MA in Renaissance literature, my doctoral work and more recent research focuses on contemporary performances of Shakespeare in Asia. So I'm very much not a scholar of the period we're talking about today. But it is impossible to think about Shakespeare's legacy in this part of the world without thinking about earlier histories of colonial occupation and the extent to which Shakespeare still stands in for a kind of cosmopolitan and Anglo-centric cultural capital. And that brings me to my second point, which is that of my positionality. As a Malaysian who calls Singapore home, I'm thinking about shared histories between these spaces at a time that precede concepts such as the nation state. And so it's from this position that I wish to introduce my topic for today, which is the Sejarah Melayu, or the Malay Annals. The Sejarah Melayu, or Sulalat al-Salatin, the Genealogy of Kings, is a collection of stories and accounts about the Malay rulers, focusing particularly on the rise and fall of the Sultanate of Malacca. The common view is that the text was edited or compiled by Tun Sri Lanang in 1614 or 15, commissioned by the Sultan of Johor. And there are many versions of this text. For example, Rulewink lists several of them. And the text in Jawi, first printed in 1881, was edited by Munshi Abdullah. Happy to inform you that a copy is available for purchase at the princely sum of 1,800 Singapore dollars. Now, the textual history of the Sejarah Melayu also marks for me a period of colonial encounter. John Lydon, a Scottish linguist, first translated the text from Jawi into English in 1821, for which Stamford Raffles writes an introduction. When we consider the extent of this unparalleled archipelago, it would be vain to assign limits or how far and wide the tide of commerce might not have flowed, or how great the progress of civilization might not have been, had they, the inhabitants, been allowed to pursue their free and uninterrupted course, protected and encouraged by a more enlightened and liberal government. And here he positions the British in relation to the Dutch. With a high reverence for ancestry and nobility of descent, they are more influenced and quicker discerners of superiority of individual talent than is usual among people not far advanced in civilization. The peculiar interest which these people excite cannot perhaps be better illustrated by the general feeling which exists towards them, on the part of every Englishman who has since been among them and become more intimately acquainted with their character. Notwithstanding their piracies and the vices usually attributed to them in their present state, there is something in the Malayan character which is congenial to British minds. So this we see how the text, like the Sejarah Melayu, was used to characterize diverse communities in the region as part of rationalizing the British colonial project. And this introduction also frames relations between the Dutch and the British in their colonial contestation over the region. This presentation of history, which attempts to establish continuity and syncretize the pre-colonial earlier history of Singapore and the arrival of Raffles, is perhaps best encapsulated in the Bicentennial Trilogy in 2019, a series of short animated videos that dramatize the Sang Nila Utama story and Raffles' influence in Singapore. And now I quickly want to consider how texts like the Sejarah Melayu might intervene in formulations about what we're calling the global renaissance. So what is the global renaissance? In her edited collection, Jyotsna Singh offers a definition. Overall, this volume tells a story of England's emerging role in the complex networks of travel and traffic in diverse regions and nations, ranging from commercial and competitive relations with European imperial powers and with non-European Islamic rulers. In doing so, it explores both the formation of English conceptions of the global and the impact of global economic, cultural, religious, and political developments on English society and culture during the 16th and 17th centuries. What becomes evident is that cross-cultural encounters generated not only material exchanges within varying and uneven power relations, but also a rich and complex cross-pollination between England and its others, both within and outside Europe. How might we consider Singh's formulation in light of texts like the Sejarah Melayu? I end my time with a series of questions, as all interlopers pose, which I hope we can discuss. How might the politics of location affect the kinds of scholarship that take place about the global renaissance? Specifically, what new knowledges might be produced when the center for creating discourse is not located in the global north? How might scholarship on the global renaissance articulate comparative relationships between contexts that do not merely reproduce binaries of West and Rest? And finally, what's at stake in the appellation of the term global to the study of the Renaissance? To what extent might each constitutive term modify the other? Thank you.
Thank you, Rowena. Thank you. That's a wonderfully rich set of questions. Thank you. So now we'll pivot to the first of our Zoom speakers, who will be Hannah. Hi, Hannah. Hannah, can you hear us?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much to everyone for having me, and especially to Dr. Hakama for setting this up. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. The title of my talk today will be Pepper, Nutmeg, and Flying Fish, the Foods That Fueled Southeast Asia's Trade with the World. So I want to start off with the first of my title, which is pepper. This is from a circa 1626 source, Isidore of Seville. The pepper tree grows in India on the side of the Caucasus Mountains, covered by sun, with leaves like those of juniper. Serpents guard its groves, but the inhabitants of the region, when the pepper ripens, set fire to the groves. The serpents are driven away by the fire, and the pepper turns black from the flame. In the ancient world, scholars believe that peppers came from trees in India that were guarded by poisonous serpents. This myth of pepper harvested by fire, guarded by these venomous mythical serpents, was capitalized on by traders who facilitated the sale of pepper all the way from Malabar on the western coast of India across the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea, with stops in Alexandria, Venice, and etc., with those cities growing increasingly rich as a result. But India, as we know, was only the starting point of the vast trading networks across Southeast Asia. The Straits of Malacca were effectively another Venice in terms of the region's power as a trading hub. I'll zoom in a little on this map. Nutmeg, as Dr. Soon has pointed out, was grown exclusively on the Banda Islands, and cloves are from an even more exclusive selection of 5 islands in the Moluccas. The Malacca Sultanate had a vast trading network, which included nutmeg, cloves, and other spices. And if you're wondering just why exactly spices that belong in something like a pumpkin spice latte, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, were so crucial to Europeans, it's because Europeans ate significant amounts of these spices in their daily cookings. English food back then was not at all what we know it to be today. And I'll just say it now, the myth of spices being used to cover up rotten or putrid stench of cooking is not a correct myth. No one was eating rotten food back then. So what were they eating? Here's a recipe from an Elizabethan named Hugh Platt. This is from a cookbook called Delights for Ladies in 1608. To souse a young pig. Take a young pig, being scalded, boil it in a fair water and white wine. Put thereto some bay leaves, some whole ginger, some nutmegs quartered, and a few whole cloves. Boil it thoroughly and leave it in the same broth in an earthen pot. So notice the spices. Ginger as well comes from maritime Southeast Asia, and the first written record of it is actually in the Analects of Confucius. And one more recipe. This is from The Closet of Sir Kennel Digby from 1677. To stew a rump of beef. Take a rump of beef, break all the bones, season it with pepper and salt to your liking. Take 3 or 4 nutmegs, a quantity of mace, beat them grossly. Then take a bunch of very good sweet herbs, a good onion, garlic, half a pint of white wine vinegar, some claret, sugar, beef suet, and butter. Shred some cabbage over and under, and scrape in a pound of good old cheese. Put these into an earthen pot, let it stand in an oven with brown bread 4 or 5 hours, but let the pot be covered close with a paste, and that is actually a crust, which was used kind of like a Tupperware purpose for baking. So when Western sailors survived long enough to make it east, their accounts of the cities along the Straits of Malacca had a touch of myth and mysticism about them. Sailors were really half expecting to find groves of pepper guarded by poisonous snakes, and they had a real desire, or you could say hunger, for the lands that grew these cloves, nutmegs, and etc., to be as mythological as their medieval sources made them out to be. One account from 1597 describes Sumatra as being the legendary port that is mentioned several times in the Bible for its famous wealth, Ophir. So he writes in 1597, out of this island, as some men are of opinion, Solomon had his gold wherewith he beautified the temple and his own palace. And then in the Bible, it should be named Ophir, for certainly Sumatra is rich of mines of gold, silver, and metal, and the inhabitants thereof are very expert in melting brass pieces. Therein is a fountain of pure balsam. So he's in the realm of myth here in describing Southeast Asia. However, there are other more accurate accounts of the region as an important trading port. So Caesar Frederick, a merchant of Venice, describes Malacca as a city of marvelous great trade of all kinds of merchandise, which come from diverse parts, both that all the ships that sail in these seas, both great and small, are bound to touch at Malacca to pay their custom there. So the food found in these Southeast Asian ports was especially wondrous for European sailors, who had incredibly high fatality rates due to shipwrecks, scurvy, starvation, disease, and often resorted to eating things like flying fish, porpoises, and even the leather of their books in order to survive. So lastly, I want to turn just very briefly to a few accounts of the actual food that European navigators encountered. These food descriptions are particularly interesting to my research because they combine both the myth and mysticism of these faraway lands that have piqued the desire of Europeans, and they also contain the very real and practical information by describing food as required for survival. So here we have description of nuts and cocos, melons, cucumbers, onions, garlics, peppers, and other spices, which liked us well. And one final description. Same day, likewise, there came a great number of scouts unto our ships, bringing all kinds of victuals to sell, hens, eggs, bananas, sugar canes, cakes of rice baked, and many other things. So, to conclude, the era of exploration was an age of incredible upheaval, as much to the real world as to the ways in which people imagined these new lands. So food was both mythical and practical for survival. And in many ways, I would argue that food is the cornerstones of these narratives of encounter. That is, from pepper and nutmeg to the realities of eating flying fish. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was so fascinating. Oh, that's just wonderful. Thank you. So rich. So suggestive. All right. Our next Zoom speaker will be Joshua, joining us from Macau.
Thanks so much, Rema, and to everybody else that you cited as helping bring this together. I want to echo your thanks to them too. I'm going to speak just briefly about what I think is part of a much larger story, which I tell in my book. And for this audience, though, we have a particular focus on early modern Singapore that I want to speak to. I'm going to try in these brief remarks to set the transition to colonial rule in Singapore in what may be an unfamiliar context, the context of education policy debates going on across the East India Company's territories, largely in India, places like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, but also extending out into this area of expansion in Southeast Asia to Singapore, Penang, Malacca, other places where the East India Company also had a presence. In short, this was a moment not only of political change and commercial change, reconfiguring of political and commercial networks, but also a moment of intellectual change, a reconfiguring of the geography of scholarship and education in Asia and in the British East India Company's dominion especially. That's going to be my theme as I pick apart this founding moment for the Singapore institution known to us today as the Raffles Institution. When Stamford Raffles established the settlement of Singapore in 1819, one of his first major projects was a university. He was thinking about Singapore at this time as a center of intellectual and not only material commerce. He envisioned it first through this university as a kind of research hub, somewhere that would bring in a lot of new products of the natural world, like the ones we just heard about in the previous talk, and impress the European Republic of Letters, all these scholars and Orientalists and scientists back in Europe with these new products, with these new discoveries in the natural world. At the same time, he thought about this as a place to make alliances with local rajas, with rulers in the surrounding region. It would be the university, a place to educate their sons and gain traction with them, gain a little bit of leverage in the kinds of diplomatic and commercial negotiations that the company and its administration in Singapore needed to do. Now, all of this, thinking about Singapore as a kind of hub for an intellectual commerce, a place to make politics through knowledge. This resonated with an old concept that the East India Company had been using in India since the 1770s, a concept of conciliation, whereby you could patronize scholars as a means of currying political favor with political classes, with rulers, both back in Britain and in Asia. The idea was that rulers in Asia and rulers back in Britain would be influenced by these scholars, bringing them knowledge thanks to the company's support. This model, however, had fallen out of favor things had moved on in India. In India, there had been a move to territorial empire, the old commercial basis and this kind of commercial mode of politics, trading knowledge for political favor, was going out of style by 1819. So Raffles's idea was a bit of a throwback to the 18th century. This kind of university he envisioned was no longer a model that was being followed in Madras or Calcutta or Bombay. Could it succeed in Singapore? Events offered an answer in the negative. Things did not go according to Raffles's plan. It took a few years to secure funding for the new institution. When it finally was built, starting in 1823, the building was poorly planned. Some workmen died in constructing the edifice. It was poorly executed. And when funding ran out, all that had been achieved was not a grand university, but a pile of bricks. And this soon, according to local newspapers, became a shelter for thieves. Meanwhile, the sons of local Rajas failed to materialize, and local inhabitants of Singapore didn't need a big university. They needed something more basic, primary education, local schools. After Raffles died in 1826, the East India Company, including his successor in Singapore, abandoned his project. They declared that it was not at all adapted to the circumstances of an infant colony. And in the 1830s, when the Singapore institution was resurrected, it took the form of a local boys' school, a form that it continues up to this day, reflecting the idea of mass education that was gaining traction now in British India. This was the model for schools now, not this 18th century model of a place to gain political favor through scholarly patronage. So this brief story I've told, I think, matters for larger stories. What I've been trying to talk about is a debate over Singapore's place in wider geographies, not just political and commercial geographies, but also intellectual geographies. Its place in the world of scholarship and ultimately education. Raffles, as I've suggested, had grand plans, but also somewhat outmoded ones, somewhat anachronistic ones, at least as understood by the East India Company. He was harking back to a kind of commercial empire that the East India Company no longer ruled over by this time. That older empire had been replaced with a territorial empire, collecting land revenue from huge tracts of land in India, not really based on trade, which had dwindled under competition and parliamentary regulation. This older model, this older commercial idea of knowledge itself was going out of fashion. Raffles's rivals, who won out, at least temporarily, saw the institution, saw this potential university, prospective university, less grandly, if also more accurately, more practically, as a sort of outpost of British India, reflecting the local needs and concerns of Singapore's inhabitants, and the need for the company to curry favor locally, not across this grand region of Southeast Asia with Singapore at its hub. And so what I've been talking about finally reveals another side to the transition to colonial rule in Singapore. A transition not only when it came to the politics of the place, the governing institutions, not only to the networks of trade that passed through Singapore, but also to the intellectual geography of Singapore and the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua. That was wonderful. And before you tell us about the picture in your background.
Oh, yes. Well, I should say that this is not a picture of any event in Singapore. This comes from Mysore, where very much the same model was being adopted around this time. This shows a local school established under the support of the East India Company and as well as the Raja of Mysore. And so it's exactly the model that the company ultimately wanted to be adopted in Singapore. You see a lot of people gathering to watch a disputation by the students in the Mysore Free School. This painting is now held in Australia, but it dates to Mysore in the 1840s, I think 1843.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't know if you could see it from Zoom, but we have students here who either have friends who went to Raffles or did themselves who were incredibly excited by your talk. Did you know this about Master Raffles? No, they said they didn't, so they learned something new. Thank you very much, Joshua. That was great. Okay, so we have our final. Did you go to Raffles too? You're laughing. Oh, no, I thought you were laughing. So we have our final Zoom speaker for today, Andrew, who will be giving a talk on Confucius. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Hi, Rayma. Hello, everybody in Singapore and the broader world. Good morning from Berlin, where it's 9:49. So yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks so much for this organization. My mind is buzzing with lots of new ideas from hearing the previous presentations. And I'm going to take my focus to Northeast Asia, which is to China. But we're going to stick in the 16th century and the late 16th century. So my point of departure is this very interesting quote from Matteo Ricci. And he writes in a letter of 1593, and Ricci was a Jesuit missionary to China, one of the first. He wrote to his superior general back in Rome, Claudio Acquaviva. The whole year we've been studying, and with my father, the companion, we finally finished a course in which we learned the morals of the literati of China, namely the 4 books of the first philosophers. Actually, if you think about it, the morals are really good, and they're really great books. And he says, here and in Japan, it's going to be a great benefit to us. And in moral, he is another Seneca. And the morale un altro Seneca. In morals, he is another Seneca. The morale un altro Seneca. So what does this mean? When I read this passage, I was slightly astonished because I'm interested in this philosophical equivalence, un altro Seneca, and it raises all sorts of questions about cross-cultural exchanges. So what were the philosophical presuppositions that made this comparison possible? What are, you might want to say, the gradations of similarities or differences? Is this a conjunction between 2 thinkers? Is it a convergence, or is it a correspondence? And if we were to use a Stoic image, what are the hidden nodes of cosmic sympathy or sympatheias between these 2 people? Or to use a term in Chinese cosmology, what are the ganying, the correlative resonance that pulsates between this dyad? Now, Ricci and his brothers not only learned the Chinese language and translated text both ways, they translated Western philosophical texts into this pure, limpid classical Chinese, as well as the Confucian classics into Latin. They also brought an entire warehouse of goods, knowledges, and culture to the host in China. They really brought to them an encyclopedia of arts and sciences. So they knew the laws of hospitality, and as visitors, they brought their very best gifts. So while living in Chaozhou, he gave lessons to a new convert in European cosmology and Greek geometry. And then later on, he translated with a recent convert the elements of Euclid, and they were the first to compile a Chinese to European language dictionary. And Ricci hung in his house a European Mappamundo, which is a translation of a map of Abraham Ortelius. And this here is the first map to show the Americas that is printed in China. And Ricci presented to the Chinese emperor the first mechanical clock and clavichord. And shortly after Ricci's death, Xu Guangqi became the director of the Imperial Astronomical Bureau and helped reform the Chinese calendrical system. So later, the Jesuits would publish works on mechanics, geography, cartography, cosmology, botany, natural philosophy, and mnemonics, music, and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And there are 2 texts I find really delightful that I want to share with you. This here is the diagrams and explanations of the wonderful machines of the Far West. Yuan Si Qi Qi Tu Shuo, which features this really delightful book wheel. I'm happy to talk about that later. And then this is also very interesting. Nian Yixiao, he translated Andrea Pozzo's Perspectiva. So this is a text on linear perspective. And then by the early Qing dynasty, Giuseppe Castiglione became the court painter to Qianlong, and he made European-style palaces and gardens. And in his Yuanmingyuan Summer Palace, it's like a Baroque European fantasy garden. So what is happening in all these cases? Now, in this discursive paradigm between Western and Chinese philosophy, I think, Ricci is trying to make a sort of harmonious triangulation. Stoicism and Confucianism serve as the base angles in which all these other things can be incorporated. And then finally and ultimately, Christianity becomes a crowning pinnacle. So Seneca is not Christian, but he can be Christianized. Confucius is not Western, but he can be Westernized. Christianity is not originally Chinese, but can be Sinicized. So in other words, for Ricci, Stoicism and Confucianism are what you might want to call propedeutic. They're the necessary preconditions of the Christian faith. So the only thing that's missing in Stoic ethics is the salvation of Christ. And the only thing that's missing in Confucian ethics is the gospel. So I hope what my talk, short talk has hopefully demonstrated is that it's broadened our understanding of what we used to think of just a purely European, Italian, French, English Renaissance to now a more inclusive global Renaissance. By global Renaissance, I mean two things, and this is responding a little bit to what Rowena challenged us to think about. That first, from the 15th to 17th century and other parts of the world, not just China, but you can also think about Persia, South Asia, Korea, and Japan. And this is for further collaborative work, that there are also intellectual movements that re-examine and rebirth their own indigenous classics. And what I've done is just show you a bit of my project this year in Berlin. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This is wonderfully fascinating. That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. All right, now we return to the in-person part of our event.
First of all, I'd just like to thank Dr. Rima Hokama for organizing this. When I first met her earlier on today, I just said to her, her indefatigable energies absolutely floor me. I stand in awe. Let that be on record. Let me just, this is basically something that I sort of pulled out of the final chapter of my recent book, Shakespeare and the Theatre of Religious Conviction in Early Modern England. I would like to begin by considering the theoretical and cultural implications of geographical allusions found in a passage like the following lines uttered by Bassanio, a playboy character of sorts, responding to news of Antonio's ill-fated argosies in The Merchant of Venice. Had all his ventures failed? What? Not one hit? From Tripolis, from Mexico and England, from Lisbon, Barbary, and India, and not one vessel escaped that dreadful touch of merchant marring rocks. When invocation of geographical lands and cartographic place names assumes the form of a list or series of items without the benefit of contextual clarification and analytical explication, their signification relies on familiarity with information made available in reports and narratives of travels undertaken by Englishmen to distant lands, compiled and published by the Anglican clergymen Richard Hakluyt and Samuel Purchas. European literature, such as the Portuguese Epic of Empire, Camões de Luciates, has contributed to English interest in the expansionist ambitions of early modern Europe. The Luciates dilates on the spices, gold, and precious stones said to be found in abundance in India, and celebrates the contribution of mercantile commerce to Portugal's rise as a colonial power. In 1600, the year in which Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice was published as a quarto, Queen Elizabeth I, attracted by news of India's wealth, granted a formal charter for London merchants trading in the East Indies to found the English East India Company, technically a joint stock company. When Shakespeare included the Indies and India in his cataloguing of geographical place names in The Merchant of Venice, He registered alertness to the international reach of England's economic and mercantile ambitions towards the end of the 16th century. India is a term that flexibly refers to the subcontinent of South Asia, as well as to that region of the world we know as Southeast Asia. India and the East Indies are thus interchangeable terms and concepts in the cartographic discourse of early modern England. Indian can refer to a native of South Asia, someone from the Spice Islands of the Moluccas, or a native of the New World, provocatively represented by Caliban in The Tempest. Tidore and Ternate, two islands in the Indonesian archipelago, enter English Renaissance literature to draw attention to the vast economic profits to be enjoyed by any nation that succeeds in monopolizing the trade in spices. As Su Fang Ng underscores, the Spice Islands were the new hub of a globalizing economy, as Europeans found a sea route that rounded the Cape of Good Hope to obtain spices directly from the source. The Merchant of Venice gestures in the direction of a much larger world that exists beyond Venice and fictitious Belmont. It points to this world by highlighting Venice's and Belmont's positioning within a connected planet enabled by ocean travel. If the entire world is the field of the merchant's business activities, the possibilities it presents for profit-making cannot be disentangled from nervousness about the risks and dangers, what Shakespeare terms hazard, associated with ocean travel. However anxious the activities of risk-taking and globalizing capitalism might prove to be, they are to be preferred over the exploitative practice of usury, which entails lending for a whopping 10% interest. In The Merchant of Venice, prospecting, whether in the form of seeking an object of romantic desire or in sending merchandising vessels abroad, is represented with reference to classical motifs, biblical typology, and the theological values associated with the Judeo-Christian tradition. If we encounter Jason and the Golden Fleece in Bassanio's romantic quest for Portia, as well as the New Testament's dispensational superiority over Judaism's outmoded legalism in Venice's relationship with Shylock, we also find ourselves in a world that appears to support the Protestant ethic and its inherent spirit of capitalism. The return of Antonio's argosies to harbor at the conclusion of the play affirms God's blessings on the capitalist activities of the Christian faithful. The elusive presence of India and the Indies in The Merchant of Venice encourages us to consider the cultural and political significance of works as diverse as the Lusiads, Donne's Elegy 19, and Milton's Paradise Lost. These works foreground the motif of India, a noun that denotes both the Mughal Empire and Indonesian archipelago. If Elizabeth I recognized India's potential as an important source of wealth for England's needy coffers, her successor, King James I, commissioned Sir Thomas Roe to be the first English ambassador to India's Mughal court. Literary allusions to India and the East Indies in Elizabethan and Stuart England can tell us much about poets and playwrights' engagement with the nation's nascent imperial fantasies, framed by the anxious recognition that England was in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, trailing European countries such as Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands in establishing Western expansionist presence in the East. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Walter. That was wonderful. The rich connections between all of these different talks that the speakers have presented are just incredible. So we have about maybe half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. This event is scheduled to run until 5 p.m. So we've ended just on time. Thank you to our speakers for keeping everything perfectly timed. So I think what I'll do is we'll have questions from you guys, from the live audience here in the room, And then for those of you on Zoom, if you want to type your questions into the chat boxes, I see that we already have some already. Then in a little bit, I'll pick some questions, or you guys can unmute yourselves and ask directly. All right, do we have questions from our in-person audience? Yes, Bart. Okay, question. Andrew, can you hear? So actually, I'm sorry. Everyone has to talk into the microphone so that the people on Zoom can hear.
Okay, so I have a question for Andrew. Thanks very much for giving an introduction to your research. So I was wondering, you mentioned how Confucianism was perceived as sort of another Stoicism in some way, or another form of Senecan thought. And I was wondering, do we have any reaction from the Chinese side when they witnessed some of the works that Ricci circulated, right? Some of the work in which he borrows Epictetus, for example, to explain Christianity to a Chinese audience. Have you encountered any kind of reactions from the Chinese side to this kind of Stoicized Christianity, and did they draw parallels with anything in their tradition? Did they see that tradition as something akin to their tradition also?
Yeah, so thank you. There are various ways to answer your questions. In the historiography, there are three prominent converts in the late 16th century and early 17th century, and they wrote kind of defenses of Christianity and tried to synthesize Confucian thought and Christian. Of course, not everybody bought that, and if you look at it just statistically and numerically, the numbers of converts were very few. At the end of the 17th century, there were maybe like numbers are very hard to come by, maybe like 10,000 or at most 100,000 out of a population of something like 100 million Chinese people, right? But what the Jesuits did have inroads to was the imperial court, right? The Jesuits had this grand ambition to convert the Emperor of China. Well, obviously that didn't work, but they were absorbed into the imperial observatory, and they were the official court astronomers. And so I think that's interesting. So in a way, the Chinese were more interested in the STEM part of Western learning.
That's so fascinating, Andrew. I've been reading Joan Paul Rubius, and it seems like the Chinese were incredibly interested in, like you say, the sciences, astronomy, and could you tell us more about why there was incredible resistance to conversion? I mean, Ritchie really failed in that endeavor, right? And the central reason for why he was in China, he did not really convert that many people. What about Chinese culture prevented that from happening?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think now the Jesuits saw a lot of correspondences, and they had this process of what is called accommodation to say, oh, these are parallel. But, when you tell a Chinese person, that this is the Word made flesh, and this is the mystery of the Trinity, and there's this man called Jesus who was also God, and he died for your sins, that sounds like extremely foreign, right? And they were also competing with the Buddhists and the Taoists.
That's
And what's interesting is that this happened when they were there in the Ming Qing transition, right? So there was the fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644, and the Jesuits were clever enough to hang on and became the astronomers to the Qing court as well. And the Qing court have their own religion, which is Manchurian, which is shamanistic, and so they had to toggle between, in a way, many different identities of Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian, and the Manchu indigenous belief systems.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, other questions from our in-person audience? No questions? So I see on Zoom, I'm not seeing any questions, but it could be all my messages are going to admin 2 direct message. Do you see questions, admin 2? Okay. We do have one comment from Eugene. Eugene, are you still on the call on Zoom? Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your presentation. I'm just a little surprised and a little piqued that the discussion of nutmegs did not include the slaughter of inhabitants in an Indonesian island by the Dutch on behalf of Japanese mercenaries for that particular spice. And I can refer you to a book about how that actually happened. And it seems that all of these stories before Singapura do not seem to highlight some of these acts of violence.
Yeah. I taught Amitav Ghosh's The Nutmeg's Curse with my students at SUTD last year. And, you know, I don't know if that's the book that you have in mind or maybe another one. What's your recommendation?
No, I'm just talking about how these wonderful stories about Singapura before Raffles still leaves a haunting specter of a pro-Anglophone discourse.
Yeah.
Now discussing the Majapahit Empire, if you look at Bukit Larangan, now called Fort Canning after Raffles, of artifacts that predate whatever has been discussed. And we should also not forget Kwa Jong Kwan, it's in the references in my chat, about 700 years of a beginning in Singapore.
Yeah, I see in your chat, not everyone in the room can see your chat, but only those, or actually really only me, I think I can see it. But John McDick was somebody who I wanted to invite.
That this has not been put on the table when you're discussing Singapore before.
Yes, but we're putting it on the table now. So we're actually really happy that you raised this comment. My own background is in English literature. And when the MOE and SUTD told me to put together many events for our Festival of Ideas, I could only boss around people from English literature and make them come because they know me already and I know them. So I didn't know you, Eugene, until now. So I would have invited you had I known of you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this moment? And I did invite scholars from Women's Studies, and they couldn't attend, unfortunately. But now we can talk about it. So
I honor
tell us.
everyone who's been on the panel, and it's been most instructive. Because I have had to do work in this relationship, because I have an NAC technical report that was published in 2005 that looked at a narrative history of music in Singapore from 1819 to the present at the time. I realized that I was impoverished in my discourse because I fell foul of an Anglophone discourse. And now, to make amends for the things that I have done, I've been looking at research that has taken us well before 1819. And this is why the Majapahit Empire, and that would explain why many of the Malay community are of Javanese ascription. And you can see the Hokkien community in Singapore long before the 19th century with Admiral Cheng He. And I'm just wondering if that discussion needs to be reopened in understanding Singapore. I mean, Singapore was responsible for the export of cinderwood to China, Korea, and the East Asian communities. Long before Sir Stamford Raffles came up with the term entrepot trade.
Who was Singapore? Who were those people?
Well, they would have been merchants. And what was cinderwood used for? It would have probably been used for ritual offering. And if this had happened 700 years before, what exactly are we looking at in terms of Singapore before Raffles? Or was Raffles simply relying on an existing infrastructure, well, to harness the finances of the East India Company?
Okay. So would anyone either
Hello,
on
hello,
stage
I'm
or
leaving
in
it
the audience like to take a stab at answering Eugene's question? We are so close in where we are today, next to the Malay Studies and Southeast Asian Studies Department. But I don't know if any of them are here today. But maybe we do have experts here who might want to answer that question. Is that a wanting to? Oh, okay. Oh, so Rowena? Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to concur with Eugene. Was it Eugene's
Yeah,
contribution? And I think this is what perhaps gets lost in the current conceptualizations of what a global renaissance means. And I think this offers opportunities for us to rethink the way that scholarship is being done. So, for example, how do we even talk about the periodicity of the Renaissance, right? Are there ways to expand it, contract it with other contexts in mind that do not necessarily conform to certain established, dare I say, Eurocentric frameworks for thinking about history? So I think this is a very valuable platform for us to have these discussions about what implications other contexts might have on our understanding of what the Renaissance can mean and what's at stake. So I certainly agree, because I think in most publications about the global Renaissance, we'd be hard pressed to find references to the Majapahites or the Srivijayan Empire, for instance. So I think events like this, I hope, will go some way to being a corrective to that.
Oh, yes.
Hello, I have two questions, one for Rowena, one for Hannah. So in the Sejarah Melayu, how was Singapore described in text? And I'm just quite curious, what exactly was Singapore's political status described in that book? And for Hannah, my question is that some of these people who travel to Southeast Asia, or in some of the texts you reviewed, are there any description of what Southeast Asian people ate during that time? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that question. So I refer to the Leiden version, and there's a section on how Sang Nila Utama goes off exploring. Even though he loved his wife very dearly, he goes off exploring and he encounters this very vast land, actually, which he takes such delight in, and he goes hunting there. And this description that's in the text, I think, is very different from more modern descriptions of Singapore being the little red dot. But he sees this vast land that he absolutely falls in love with, and he says to his mother-in-law that this is where he wants to sort of start something new. And so then shipments of people and cattle arrive from Palembang and other places to come and support his sort of start establishment of a new community in Temasek. So at least this is what the text tells us. Which I think is a fascinating account of Temasek at the time. So yeah, I guess this is also why references are being made to 1299 and Sang Nila Utama as this sort of pre-Raffles figure for thinking about founding, quote unquote, the founding of Singapore in some sense.
Thank you, Rowena. Hannah, do you want to answer that question about food?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, great question. Honestly, the exact same question I have also had. So my sources are obviously limited by my own background as a Renaissance European scholar and my own limits in language. But my source, which is Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, which is a sort of vast compendium of travelers' tales translated into English as, of course, part of the British sort of narrative of conquest and nation building, which certainly we should acknowledge, as Eugene has said, is certainly full of bloodlust and massacre and horror. There are very few examples of what Southeast Asians ate as independent from what the explorers were eating. There's a couple instances where they say stuff like oxen are very dear in this part of the world, so it's eaten sparingly. Many accounts of sort of there is no bread in this region but rice. But frankly, the European imagination is really wrapped up in its own capitalization and extracting resources. And so even when we see exchanges of food, it's often just how the Europeans could profit off of that.
That's really fascinating. If I might add to that, I've been reading Hathwaite's Principal Navigations as well and thinking about travel writing. And I think there's not as much about food as you would think, but there is some. So kueh makes an appearance, steamed rice cakes, and the fascination with how the Indonesians in particular steam rice in these pots. And they've never seen rice cooked that way before. But of course, as Hannah's saying, it's always through the lens of Eurocentric ideas. So they say, oh, the desserts, they're not sweet enough for our taste buds. And they don't have butter. That's the central shortcoming. They don't use eggs and butter in their desserts. They have these kueh steamed rice cakes, right? But then, and moving far out of Southeast Asia, Pereira, who I talked about in my introduction, he spends time as a prisoner in China. And he says things like, the Chinese are superior to us in the way they eat. They don't even need napkins like we do because they feed with 2 sticks and everything's pretty chopped up for them. So they can eat in a very neat way. They never smear crumbs on their face. And, Europeans at this time were eating with their hands and everything, right? And they had to wipe their hands on these napkins. And they're like, oh, we should maybe take some innovations from the way people eat in Asia. So yeah, there is a little bit, but maybe not as much as we would think, right? All right. Maybe we can pivot back to Zoom because I have a question from Rathika. Rathika, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? She has a question for Walter and Emily. Oh, and also directed at me. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Can you hear me? We don't hear you if you're unmute. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask us? Oh, okay. So I'll read your question. Thank you for an enlivening and exciting discussion on Asia in the global renaissance. My question is mainly for Walter Lim and Emily Soon. What sort of impact did these literary imaginaries of England and Europe's engagements with Asia, Shakespeare, Milton, Camillus Middleton in plays, pageants, poems, have on the everyday lives of English people, and how did it affect their understandings of Asia?
Can you just repeat that? My hearing is a little bit.
Oh, yeah, okay. So question for Walter and Emily, what sort of impact did these literary imaginaries of England and Europe's engagements with Asia in the plays, pageants, and poems have on the everyday lives of English people, and how did it affect their understanding of Asia?
Okay, my sense of it.
Well, Walter, talk into the microphone so people can hear. Yeah.
My sense of it is that by and large, the average person is not going to impact them in any substantive kind of way, right? Unless you were to read travel narratives, in particular, those by Hakluyt and Purchas. Now, the thing is that a lot of these things that enter into the dramatic production of early modern England usually tend to be. Let me just give an example. Now, like for instance, it is pretty much unlikely that anybody in Shakespeare's London would have encountered a Jew in his or her lifetime, because there was a massive, basically they were dispossessed from the realm in 1290. But nevertheless, you do have a play in which it is presented as if Shylock were, a real life person, in addition to the fact that there are aspects of caricature. My own sense is that the average person is, if anything, is going to be an armchair reader of material pertaining to Asia. Having said that, you have those people who are involved in merchandising ventures, mercantile ventures. You have the setting up of the founding of the English East India Company, right? When you have geographical place names invoked in a play like The Merchant of Venice, they are not elaborated. I mean, they're just names, okay? The names might resonate for some, but there's no guarantee that the names would resonate for everyone. Like, for example, there's the reference to Mexico. Kind of took me by surprise. Mexico. What would it have meant to the early modern English audience? The conquistadors, Hernan Cortes, right? That sort of thing. I mean, what I'm interested in are just sort of whether I'm able to chart patterns based on the invocation of names, like Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan's trajectory, itinerary. I mean, his movement from hell to the Garden of Eden. Suddenly you find that you are in the Indonesian archipelago. And then you pretty much end up in India, except that India is, you enter India through the allusion to fig leaves, right? But at the same time, the discourse of shame, when they first discovered that they were naked after the fall, also intersects with the discourse of the Amerindian, the savage, the kind of Caliban figure. So that's the best that I can respond. It's not at any level of substantive detail or in-depth understanding of Asia. I mean, England was belated coming into the race for empire building. So in something like the Merchant of Venice, what I see are quite a lot of anxieties. You have a kind of a global imaginary, but at the same time, a lot of what is going on in the play is very hazardous, right? I mean, the word hazard occurs again and again, right? And it's a whole hazardous enterprise. I mean, Shakespeare didn't have a concerted vision of what it means, for example, to tap the wealth of the Orient, but it is there in the air, the Luciettes, right? The Richard Fenshaw translation was not available to Shakespeare as yet, but the sense that Portugal, and Europe in general are way ahead of England, that is the reality on the ground. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Walter. Emily?
Okay, so maybe I could just add on about maybe just 2 points. One, I would agree with Walter about the whole thing about there perhaps not being as much direct impact as we would perhaps like to see as modern critics. But I think perhaps just to add on, there was an incident in the early 1620s, and I've probably got the date wrong, in which there was a massacre on the island of Amboina. And it's called a massacre, but it's not really, by modern standards, it's actually quite small scale. And the people who were executed were mainly English and Japanese. And they were executed because of trading conflicts with the Dutch. And when news got back to England, this created a huge ruckus in between the English and the Dutch. And there was a play that was drafted to commemorate the Amboina massacre. However, it was cancelled. They were not allowed to perform it. And so I suppose that the fact that this play was cancelled, the script has been lost, it's never been found, shows that there was the fear, at least among the authorities, that if there was a play showcasing violence in the East Indies, admittedly this between Europeans, not between Europeans and the local people, there was the fear that it would have an impact on English society and its relationship with the Dutch. So I think that's a sort of negative example of what they thought literature could do, even though we don't actually have proof of what it did because the play was cancelled. And in the longer term, I think the Island Princess did have an impact on English society in the terms of one particular piece of music that was created for the 1699 restoration adaptation. So that would be, it was adapted several times. In that particular adaptation, Jeremiah Clarke wrote the trumpet march for it. Since then, that trumpet march has become quite popular. It continues to be used, I believe, in weddings in Britain. In terms of the Lusiads, I think the longer term significance is that it was taken up in later centuries by the East India Company. So the East India Company commissioned a fresh translation of it by Mickle, and Mickle described it as being the epic poem of commerce. And so for the East India Company in later centuries, they found that this text was useful. So I completely agree that in the time period, there's no direct evidence of it shaping lives.
Mhm. Yeah, Walter, talking to the microphone. Yeah.
When you
Yeah, use the one on the stand. Yeah.
the play about the Amboina massacre that was not performed, are you thinking of Dryden's play? No, yeah, I was curious. Later I may get sort of from you details about that play that I'm not familiar with. Thank you.
Yeah, so Andrew, you have your hand up, and I was actually thinking this would be a perfect question for you as well, because that wonderful line from Ritchie is Confucius is in morals, he's another Seneca, right? So did that, I mean, my question to you was, did that have an impact on, I mean, European sense of what Asian morals could be? But maybe you have something else to add as well, Andrew. Oh, you're muted, Andrew.
Sorry, it's been like 4 years since I've learned Zoom and I still haven't mastered it. I have a question for all the panelists and maybe to you, Josh. And can you tell us about the Imaginarium and the semantic sense of the Indies or India? Because you have the West Indies and East Indies, and even English poets play a lot with the West and the East Indies. And then, you're not really sure when Shakespeare uses, the boy from India and the Indian boy in Midsummer's Night's Dream. Is that a West or East Indian boy? And so how did the East India Company envision this geographical space of the Indies versus India and the Indie Islands and so forth?
Well, thanks for the question. It gets to the heart of some of the slippage between different registers that was so common at the time. I mean, these were very loose designations, and the Indies, ultimately came to mean more of the Southeast Asian archipelago. Originally, it's a rough term for India and the Southeast Asian mainland and archipelago, and it comes to be more specific as the company and other Europeans have more of a presence there, as they map these territories more intensively. And so in my book, which talks about the East India Company's whole sphere of operations, I deal with an area, just to give you, a sense of how broad we're talking here. I deal with an area all the way from the Red Sea to the Pearl River Delta. And all of that could be called the Indies, because in fact, the East India Company has commercial privileges that relate to that whole sphere of operations. So from the British point of view, as per their royal charter from the Crown, that's their area of operations, and other commercial outfits are not allowed to trench upon it, at least for a long time. Ultimately, they do get, they are able to regulate and ultimately destroy the company's monopoly. But the sphere of their operations has a lot to do with the geography as it's conceptualized. Indies, very broad, ultimately comes to have a slightly more specific meaning, as Indies and India become slightly different ideas. But this is quite late. So if we're talking the 17th century, I'd be hard pressed, at least from the things I've read, to understand a clear distinction between parts of, between India and the Indies, and a clear sense of the boundaries of the Indies. These things are still being mapped at the time and still being seen very, very broadly as an area for the operations of the East India Company.
That's wonderful. We have another question on Zoom, but I wanted to see first if any of our speakers here wanted to answer Andrew's question. Okay, we have Callista Chan on Zoom, who is asking a wonderful question. Callista, do you want to read out your question to us?
Okay, hi. Yes, I'm Callista. Um, I'm asking as an English literature student and a teacher myself. I was Dr. Lim's student actually. And with these intersections between Asia and the global Renaissance in mind, what are the stakes for modern, or maybe more specifically, local readers of Renaissance literature? Does Singapore, past and present, have a place in Renaissance literature, especially taking into account our tradition of narrative making? Yeah, so this is just a question open to anyone. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I wonder if maybe I could direct this at Emily. Emily's written on, in addition to the global Renaissance and earlier East-West encounters, she's also written on Shakespeare's status as part of the colonial curriculum, I think in 20th century Singapore, right? How do you think about, I mean, the fact that Shakespeare was in your research, this, I want to say, an icon for this kind of colonial ideal citizen, right? Is that right? Am I summarizing you correctly? But clearly you yourself are a student of Shakespeare and clearly I think love him. That's why you did a PhD in Renaissance literature. How do you think about, or how do you all think about this question from Callista?
Okay, so the question's on Shakespeare's place in Singapore and the impact of English literature on Singaporeans. I think it's a great question. I think when we look at the way that Shakespeare was used in Singapore classrooms, it gets used differently. So yes, on one level, it was used as an agent of empire, but it was also used quite creatively. So you've got people doing wayang Shakespeare, you've got people incorporating and doing intercultural things in the early 20th century, and later on, I think Rowena also studies the more 21st century versions of those things. So I think it gets used in quite interesting ways. Sometimes it's quite pro-nationalist, and I think some people have suggested that it can be used to articulate a vision of Malaya's future in sometimes along quite racial lines, which is interesting. I think in terms of what the role of Renaissance literature in classrooms today would be, I think that it's really interesting to get students to think about the old text. So I teach the Luciads, and I get students to think about, okay, how does it shape your impressions of Asia? How do people, in what ways is it Orientalist? In what ways is it not? And I think it's useful for my students to try and process where particular stereotypes may come from and how they think that it may be trying to shape their own minds and their own sense of who they are today. And so that's just my take. I'd be interested to hear what others have done.
Yeah, and Rowena you also work on Asian contemporary adaptations of Shakespeare as well.
Yes, I do, though I've been trying to trace a more sort of historical through line. I think I understood Callista's question to be a little different, though, in that, and it's reminding me about the place of education institutions and the ecology in which we teach the quote-unquote global Renaissance, if ever, and the extent to which Shakespeare functions as a shorthand for many things, but Shakespeare in Singapore seems to function as a shorthand for the Renaissance, right? He has come to kind of dominate discourse on early modern culture. And so I guess, Callista, your question is making me think of the ways in which the sort of education systems and ecology works in Singapore surrounding the global Renaissance. I mean, I'm reminded of my own privilege thinking about where to do a master's, and I thought to myself, where else can one do an MA on Renaissance literature if not in the global North? I don't know if that is still the case, but I think it's a question that I think as educators here at autonomous universities, we might like to think long and hard about. So thank you for the question.
Walter, do you want to answer Callista's question since she's your former student?
Do you want?
Okay. If, for example, I understand that question, it's a good question because it is so multi-layered and I do not know how to begin responding to it, except to say that the question about the place of English studies, if I understand it correctly, in literary studies in Singapore, what are the implications? I don't think that we have really ever subjected Shakespeare's corpus to a distinctively post-colonial interpretation perspective, right? I mean, the kind of work that Rowena does of Asian adaptations of Shakespeare is the closest that we have of yielding opportunities for post-colonial interventions. Okay, I mean, my own thought of it is that we don't have a lot of the anxieties of other post-colonial nations with regards to the English curricular structure, the English curriculum. We have no problems using English, but not having those anxieties also means that at some level you are ratifying certain assumptions, which is, for instance, if you say you teach Shakespeare and your class of students think that Shakespeare is the great, iconic figure of literary studies, the god in the firmaments, and so on and so forth. Effectively, you are sort of ratifying at some level a conception that has been, in a sense, in a real sense, sort of taught to you by our erstwhile colonial masters. All I can say is that over the years, I've taught at NUS for over 3 decades. What happens is that over the years, I find that the sense of the centrality of Shakespeare is not the same as when I started teaching, right? I mean, this time around is the lowest number of students I ever had taking my Shakespeare course. There are other more important things like anime. And so that's how, that's how life goes. But there is at least a book, I can't recall the title right now, about just English studies in India and how it is used as an instrument of the consolidation of imperial power. So there is work that is done there. I mean, obviously influenced by Edward Said's Orientalism. Yeah. With regard to the global Renaissance, during this whole round table, I just got myself to thinking. It almost appears as if to do global Renaissance with Southeast Asia in the picture, you need to be involved in some kind of a comparativist, project. Okay, that's fine. But I'm just thinking, when you do that, might you at some level be taking something away from Orientalist structures that were at play, especially when England, obviously having very little contact with, with India, with the East Indies, and so on and so forth. Like the Sir Thomas Roe guy, he is the official ambassador to India sent by James I. And when he wrote about India, it wasn't in very flattering terms. But the point is that, but England did not have any real clout politically at that moment in time. But you already have a discourse of representation, a discourse of kind of interpreting the space of cultural alterity in terms that prepare in many ways the groundwork for the later sort of grounding of empire. So all I'm saying is that these are very interesting questions, even as we move towards the concept of the global Renaissance. What I see going on is a certain flattening of difference in terms of English representation of the other, and the idea that, everything was done on an equal footing. I'm just suggesting that it was not, but it was more complicated than that, largely because England was far from being an empire. The 2 major projects of Renaissance England were the New World, the Americas, and Ireland. Not so much Asia, but because Europe was, having its pause in Asia, and then England decided, look, we have to play catch up. I mean, that was the ethos, basically, the conditions at that time.
Thank you, Walter. So Melissa has just joined SUTD, and that transition from teaching we have a question from Eugene too about Beowulf and oral narratives. And I know you're teaching Beowulf, I think, at SUTD. Do you also want to take a stab at answering this question of what does it mean to teach Western texts and medieval and Renaissance texts here in Asia? Or maybe tell us about what that was like for you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this is very thought-provoking for me as well, because in my field, I suppose what Shakespeare is to the Renaissance and the kind of centrality, right, that he has, that Walter and Rowena were speaking of. Chaucer is kind of to the Middle Ages. So whenever you structure a medieval English lit syllabus, usually he's kind of the primary person or kind of the representative writer who is on those syllabi. And so this is getting me thinking a lot too about expanding curricula and expanding the kinds of writers and cultures that are represented in syllabi and the kinds of writers that we normalize, right, in the classroom. So yeah, I think that's also where comparative frameworks can be really helpful, even if it's not a kind of direct historical causality or a direct historical exchange, or on the basis of that, because like with the two women that I spoke of, I think if you had something like that, a comparative angle like that in a class or on a syllabus, it'd be really helpful to kind of come at something like lyric from different kind of cultural angles or different historical angles as well. So yeah, just all of this discussion of educational ecologies and the kinds of writers that are represented on syllabi and normalized, I think, is really thought-provoking. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Do we have any other questions from our in-person audience? I have so many questions, yeah. Oh, Ishan? I think it's on the bottom. Yeah, there's a button on the bottom.
I was hoping Dr. Joshua could elaborate a little about the structures of universities before, what precedents for commercial university there were that Raffles wanted to turn Singapore institution into.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also would like to make a general comment about this event, but like, should that wait till later?
Oh, you can make it now.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate how difficult it is to organize something like this. With and drawing people, and I think it's worthwhile drawing people from English literature to talk about this topic and try and decolonize the field a little. But it really does feel like partly because the English Renaissance has had such a hegemonic force on our worlds that it's the stuff that's really outside of English, and to a certain extent the Chinese language, which I've been finding most valuable here, like the Luciad, like Matteo Ricci. And I also, since we've got this discussion about the global Renaissance, I do wish it even have had some reflections on how early modern Southeast Asia figured in African heritage, in Middle Eastern and Indian heritage, because I appreciate this going beyond the Malay Studies program because they've already said a whole bunch about it. We need to hear more. But there's also this curious lack of seeing of the agencies of people in early modern Southeast Asia. Why are we talking about Yu Xianzi when we could be talking about Hamza Pansuri? Okay, yeah, but yeah, Dr. Joshua, please.
Yeah, those are great comments. And as I thought about the optics for this event, like I said earlier, I can only boss around people from English Lit, right? I bossed these people around, made them come. But this is the kernel of a beginning of a conversation, right? Oh, all right. So, and we'll talk more. Thank you for that. All right. So the question for Joshua was about, see, I've forgotten already. Joshua, do you remember? It was the, it was,
I remember
yes, okay.
precursors to the Singapore institution and what
Yes.
ultimately became the Raffles Institution. I'm not aware that there was anything that might be called a university in the area. I think that if Raffles had a model in mind, and remember that his goal is in large part to cultivate scholars who have pull with political elites. So given that, I think his model, if anything, is the Batavian institution in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, under the Dutch, which is a learned society which does have some Orientalist activities around it in the sense of working with regional languages and natural history and creating an outpost for the Republic of Letters, making it a world of letters. And this is something that you see if you look at intellectuals in Europe at the time, that they're really interested in those outposts of European empires and all the goods and ideas and observations about exotic manners and cultures. And so I think that Raffles had that sort of a learned society in mind as much as an educational institution. Ultimately, this project fails and it becomes a local school. But under Raffles's original idea, which says a lot about the earlier ideas of the company dating back to the 18th century, when it's embattled and sees scholarship as a way to cultivate allies, as a way to win political influence. I think that's the kind of conversation, that's the kind of precedence that you would place this project into. And how that changes, how that's no longer fashionable in the 1820s, I think is quite interesting and sort of the larger story that I was getting to and that I talk about in my book.
That's so fascinating, Joshua. When I was listening to your talk, you talked about the way Raffles' model really failed and kind of declined in the early 19th century. But then I sort of thought about the Startup University here in Singapore and how that model seems kind of alive and well, right? I mean, SUTD was founded by MIT. And then I think SMU, Emily, am I right, was founded by Wharton. And then, of course, we have Andrew representing Yale NUS, which is founded by Yale. And then we have Duke NUS here. So I don't know, maybe Raffles lives on in the Startup University. I don't know, anyone have thoughts on that? Yeah.
Can I make one point?
Oh, sorry. Did you want to add to that, Joshua?
Yeah, I
sure.
have a sort of broader thought
Go ahead,
that's
Josh,
pulling
and then
together.
I'll.
Oh, I'm sorry, Andrew. I didn't mean to jump on your comment there. This may be leading in a totally different direction, but in a way, it pulls together a lot of the comments so far, which is that, to me, I don't work in Singapore, so I'm really interested. I work in another little port city called Macau. And this is something that I always say to historians of Macau as a sort of provocation, which is that you can't actually study any of these places in isolation, especially port cities, because they were all connected to each other. And you have to think about them as a constellation of places that all related to each other, because the fortunes of one directly affected those of another. If merchants are going to one versus another, that is can be a crisis. Goods always move from one to the other, and so they're often very linked in terms of the news and people and ideas that travel there. And so to me, that's, and my story about education is really that story in one aspect, because the education policies pursued in port cities in India travel over to Singapore. And Raffles isn't able to make Singapore a model of a different kind, at least not immediately. And this is getting away from your question of how that model might resonate today. But I think that this is something missing so far from our discussion, but in the background, which is the relations of Singapore to all these other port cities in the area, pre-colonial and colonial and post-colonial.
Andrew?
Sure. I just want to respond to some of the comments by Yishun and Eugene. I understand his possibly implicit frustration or his polemics, but I think we'd all love to study Spanish, Portuguese, Netherlandish, and Sanskrit history and narratives and historiography, but there are just no institutional infrastructure for that anywhere in the global north and the global south, right? And we are bound by our disciplines which we did not construct and that we have to be credentialed for. And we're also bound by the limitations of our knowledge and abilities. And so it would be great for this plea for comparative work, but comparative work can only be possible if there are institutional support and infrastructure to do so, right? So nobody is teaching, well, except in US before, we did read Sanskrit epics and Malay annals, but there's no one teaching Sanskrit literature or literature and translation or language itself, right? Anywhere in Singapore. So that's just my comment.
No, we teach a global literatures class at SUTD, and we have Alistair Gorno, my colleague, who is a South Asianist who is on Zoom. And we also have taught the Malay annals in the past, along with Lion City, too, stories from Lion City.
Okay, great. Sorry, I stand corrected.
Okay, all right. Other questions? Questions from our speakers to each other, perhaps? Final questions? All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending our roundtable on the global renaissance, thinking about the role of Singapore, India, and China, and the many ways in which these places interconnected in the early modern period. Let's give all of our speakers a round of applause for their wonderful contributions. All right, so for those of you who are here in person, definitely stick around. We have refreshments outside. Thank you, MOE colleagues, for that. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you to our Zoom speakers. We'll be in touch further. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Thank you, everyone on Zoom as well for attending. Thank you.